Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It is Monday, March 14, 2016. And tonight's webinar combines the idea, a couple of concepts, or really overlapping concepts. I'm going to talk first of all about a model called the drama triangle. And then I'm going to talk about a paper that was written based on the drama triangle that I think gives us some insight into the roles that we play in our relationships, gives us some insight into the differences but similarities that these different rigid roles have with each other, and then how to get out of it, and how to develop a more authentic, honest, aware sense of self in our relationship. So with that preamble, let me get right into it. Tonight we're starting off with the drama triangle. And the drama triangle is a simple model. In fact, I'll go to the second slide to give you the model. It has three basic roles in the drama triangle, and they are the persecutor, rescuer, and victim. And these are based on scripts of roles that we learned from our family of origin, oftentimes associated with messages like don't feel, and it's not okay to feel uncomfortable or certain emotions. And so to do that, to ward those feelings off, we develop these rigid roles to prevent ourselves from feeling it. It also is a way to dispel or get rid of guilt and shame, and to make it an outside problem instead of an inside problem, something that we need to work through. It's the way that the rules and the roles define the way that we're allowed to interact with each other. And so that's what's inherent in these things, is there are certain rules and roles that they play. And the purpose is, like I said, it creates a sense of powerlessness, and that's the benefit, right? Because if I'm powerless, right, if I can't do anything, then there's no work for me to do. It's happening to me, right? I get rid of the responsibility of my own journey, of my own work. I love what one of the narrators says in the film Finding Joe, when he said that to become a hero of one's life, one has to stop becoming a victim to one's life. And I think that's that heroic journey that Joseph Campbell talked about is letting go of the victim stance and getting rid of phrases like I can't, I have no choice, I had to, they made me, things like that. It prevents equality. So it gives people different levels of power. And again, with that, there is this victimness to it, right? With these different levels of hierarchy, then I'm not fully responsible for my own life. Somebody else is responsible for it. And if I'm the one looking down, then I can blame them also for things. So it prevents equality. Like I said, it externalizes responsibility and guilt. It masks vulnerability, authenticity, and spontaneity. Flexibility is another word I put in there, with rigidness and reactiveness. So those are kind of the opposites of it. If we talk about getting out of the drama triangle, we talk about living authentically, being vulnerable, telling our truth, having spontaneous, flexible responses to situations. Responses that come from the prefrontal cortex, from that higher level of thinking. Responses that come from a place that's away from fear and shame and guilt and trauma. So that's the way out of it. That's the opposite of it. Like I already showed you this simple diagram, and notice that the high and the low positions, right? The victim, at least on the outside, classically has less power, and the others have a one-up position. The persecutor is the one pointing the finger down, and the rescuer is the knight in shining armor, the one who's rescuing the helpless, defective victim in this sense. And remember, I'm not talking about victim in terms of there is such a thing as being a victim to a crime or a victim in a certain incident. That's not it. This is a role, a psychological way of viewing yourself that keeps you limited, right? It keeps you in a story that's not true. So I'll talk about the three different roles, and then I'll talk about an idea about gateways into them and some common thoughts that go along with this. And what you'll notice, like I said, is you'll notice some similarities. And I think that's important because persecutors and rescuers don't like to see themselves as victim, but they all have an element of victimhood in them. The persecutor is the blamer. They set strict limits. It's often arbitrary and autocratic, very critical, right? They're very clear about the other person's problems and faults. And not only do they create that story, buy into that story, and try to sell that story to the victim, but they also, they weed out or filter out information that doesn't fit the story, and they focus attention on fitting the story. For example, in the book by the Arbinger Institute, they talk about this idea. That's the excuse me, I'm forgetting the name of it. The Anatomy of Peace. They talk about this idea because what happens is if I need to see you as a broken person, I'm going to create scenarios that actually feed into that, right? I'm going to find ways. In Leadership and Self-Deception, the sequel to the Anatomy of Peace, they give a story, an example of where a son comes home just 1 minute before his curfew. And the father, who's playing the persecutor role, goes after him and says, you took a risk, right? Even though the son was on time, it was only 1 minute before his curfew, he still had to fit his son's behavior into the story that he had created and was selling to his son. They keep the victim oppressed. It's activated and driven by anger. The persecutor often has an angry, agitated, rageful type of presentation. They definitely avoid self-evaluation. And this is an important thing for all of us parents to look into. Are we willing to say, look, I'm a part of this problem. I'm a part of this dance. That's going to be one of the questions that helps all of us get out of these patterns, is do we have enough ego strength? Do we have enough serenity, confidence, self-awareness, self-esteem to be able to say, I have some part in this dance? And so often, when parents begin this process, they will say to me, why do I need to do work? This is not my problem. It's their problem, right? That's oftentimes very from a place that's just unenlightened or ignorant, right? Uneducated. That's their part. And then as they do a little bit of this work, they go through a phase where they start to see their participation in the dynamic. And that oftentimes leads to a depression or a guilt or an anger. And then, of course, as they move through that, they get to a very liberated place that many of you are experiencing or have experienced, where they can say, yes, I've been a part of this dance with my child and with others in my life, and now I know what my work is. And now I'm liberated from being a victim to it. So it's activated by anger. It's rigid and autocratic, like I said. Avoiding self-evaluations. Doesn't own his or her part. When hurt or overwhelmed, they call names or accuse others of fault. They don't talk in terms of I statements. I feel, I think, this is what's going on for me. It is, you're a jerk, you're a loser, you're selfish. I love that phrase, you're selfish. You're selfish is the phrase that people use when they're hurt by us or feel rejected by us, or we're too much for them, right? I try never with my clients, never with my family, I try never to use the word, the phrase you're selfish, because it has no meaning. And if somebody really was being selfish, it would be from a compromised and hurt and wounded place, and to shame them about it wouldn't be the solution, wouldn't be the healing. Phrases that I came up with that are a part of the vocabulary of the persecutor. Like I said, I don't have a problem. They're responsible for my actions. They are broken, bad, stupid, inadequate. They are the problem. I don't have anything to work on in this situation. I have no other choice. I've told this story for years that when I teach parents the communication model that we use, and I teach them the I feel statement. I teach them the 4 parts. I feel this way when I think. I feel this way when this happens. I feel this way when I think. And then the last one is a 2-parter where they say, and here's what I want and hope for, which is outside of my control, and here's what I want and hope for that is inside of my control. I can't tell you how many intelligent parents over the years, and I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of them, have been unable to, in the beginning, identify what they can hope for, what they can look for or want that's inside of their control in a given situation. Right? If my son's acting out, doing drugs, my daughter's cutting on herself, eating disorder, not going to school, whatever it is, whatever the behaviors are, they don't even know how to think about. And then that's just evidence of they haven't learned this new way of being, this new sensibility in being in relationship to children and others who struggle. And then having the strength, feeling okay enough, learning that they're okay even though they have healing to work on and things to work on in their life. So the victim role. They feel victimized, oppressed, helpless, hopeless, powerless, and ashamed. Remember, and the benefit of that is you don't have responsibility. It's happening to you. I always used to have my clients write a paper on the benefits of depression, which none of them wanted to do. And they would argue with me, there are no benefits. And I would say, well, there's a few of them. People lower the bar with you, right? That happens. People oftentimes feel pity for you. And people oftentimes try to soothe you, sometimes rescue you. And not that your depression is consciously chosen, but to start to become honest with yourself, it's important to see the payoffs, the rewards for this stance and for depression. They will look for a rescuer that will perpetuate their negative feelings toward themselves. So they look for other people to rescue them. I see it happen in the field with students and staff. Sometimes when the staff is being very clear and direct with another student, I see these feeling really victimized by proxy, right? Vicariously feeling victimized when a staff is being loving and tough at the same time and being clear with their communication with somebody, say during an impact letter group or something like that. They avoid decisions, solving problems, pleasure, and self-understanding, right? It's important in this role, this rigid role, to stay in the helpless place. They assume a dejected stance, right? And that's the one thing. The one thing about the acting in, the self-loathing, the victim, the depressed person, the person who's cutting on themselves or suicidal, is that stance tends to evoke in other people more compassion and pity. Whereas the acting out presentations, right, the aggression, the stealing, the drug using, right, the kind of acting out behavior tends to get a harsher response. And so that dejected stance has that secondary gain of evoking a more compassionate, maybe leaning into the pitiful response, so the pitying response. Yeah, I hear this from people in the stance saying to their rescuers and to their therapists who they want to enroll as their rescuers, or their parents who they're trying to enroll as their rescuers, you're the only one that can help me. I was just working with a parent this weekend during a parent visit where that was the way that her child hooked her, right? He was doing a great job of creating this magical bond, and then that led to him asking her to violate some basic rules of the program. And then she was asked by him to keep the secret, to not tell the therapist. So there's an induction that the victim does with the rescuer. Phrases like, they abandoned me, you don't love me, if you don't agree with me, give me what I want, I won't feel loved. I hear clients in the field say that all the time to their parents. If you don't do X, Y, or Z, you don't love me, right? Or you don't get me, you don't understand me even. And I would often say to my clients, I would say, so how can your parents demonstrate that they understand you other than just agreeing with you and giving you what they want? Because if that's the only way, then you might be at an impasse with them. Because it's possible to understand somebody and still not want to give them what they're asking for. That's possible. But again, the victim plays on that emotional vulnerability in the rescuing parent, in the rescuing relationship. They made me, I have no choice. You're going to notice this on all the slides when I go through these three roles. All of them have the I have no choice. That's why in the impact letter instructions that you got when your child was first in our program, it says, own the responsibility for sending your child. I can't tell you how many parents write in that opening paragraph without being coached. They write, I had no choice other than, right? I had no choice other than to send you to evoke. And I think what you mean is, I felt compelled. It was important to me. The decision was clear for me. But it's okay to say, I chose to send you there, right? That we always have a choice in a situation. We might not have all the freedom, but we always get to choose something. The rescuer position. Rescues when really doesn't want to, right? There's this conflict, right? There's a resentment that's underlying it. And at least, and I'll talk about this, it comes with a lot of emotional strings attached. There's a lot of guilt if they don't rescue. You know when you're doing something out of guilt that you're setting yourself up for resentment. Right? You're not doing it from... That's people always ask me about what's the difference between rescuing and codependency and love. Well, love doesn't come with strings attached. It doesn't come from a sense of guilt. It comes from... love, by definition, is a gift. It is a giving. And a letting go. And an honesty and a clarity. But rescuing comes with that guilt and those strings. It tends to keep the victim in the dependent state. That's when we talk to our staff and we talk to our parents about what can they do. You're always asking yourself, is this something they can do on their own? You can't give yourself a hug. You really can't. So if somebody asks for a hug, you give it to them. But if somebody asks you to do something that they can do, maybe with some great effort on their own, then it's okay to let them do it. right? It's okay not to participate in the reinforcement of the helplessness. There's an expectation to fail in rescue attempts, right? There's a certain kind of pessimism with it, again. Because, again, they're trying to control something. And there's a part of it that they want it to fail to keep them in that pattern of the one that is being depended on. Marshmallow, blown by the wind personality, right? It's easy. All of us have some of these. And so it's easy to... I was talking to a parent recently, and we were going over some skills, some tools, some responses for his child. And I said at the end of the call, you're going to forget this. It's okay. This is new. And you'll forget this. And he said to me, I'm taking notes to remind. And I said, that's good. That can be helpful. And it's okay if you'll forget it. And then we'll talk again next week. And then you'll forget it again. Then we'll talk again. Then you'll see your child. And then you'll forget it for sure. And then we'll talk again. And you'll begin to learn it. Right? That's what happens with this stuff. Because it starts to become internalized. It starts to become core to us. Not something we've borrowed, that we're trying, right? That we're practicing, but it starts to become part of us. And then the other, capital O, the other doesn't knock us off the space where we stand, the place where we stand. We know who we are. The core belief of the rescuer is that my needs are not important and self-care is selfish. I'm going to talk about this with parenting because it's especially dangerous and toxic for parents to have that. That's why in my book, I talk about how the trap of selfless parenting. It often leads to a martyr role, and they are horrible at asking for help. The rescuer will say things like, I don't need anything. As a parent, I've always done everything out of love. When I hear a parent say that to a child or to me about a child, I cringe, because that's impossible. And it suggests that the child has no legitimate right to be hurt or angry or sad with you. And if they are, they're bad. Something's wrong with them. They're betraying you. They're dishonoring you. They're not loving you. So we can say, I try to do that. I try to do it from a place of love, and sometimes I fail. Sometimes I'm not clear. Sometimes I do things to take care of myself. Rescuers often will talk about how love cures them. Love is the fuel, but it's not the steering wheel. Right? And love, when it is the fuel, encourages us to do courageous, difficult, heroic, painful, scary, uncomfortable things. If that's true, then love can contribute to a cure. But the act of loving on somebody is not the entire picture, of course. And it's really not about curing them in a sense. It's about finding your authenticity, presenting that to the other, and then letting go of attachment. Of course they are struggling and can't make it. Look at what has happened to them. This is when empathy robs accountability, right? I hear parents say, I divorced, I yelled at them, I worked too much. And my response is, those are things to work on. Those are things you can be accountable for. Those are things that you can acknowledge, even write about to your child. And it's okay to say, in a very gentle, loving, patient, not right away way to the child to say, now what are you going to do about it? You have a particularly imperfect parent in these specific ways. And you have these traumas. And I want you to talk about them. And I want you to grieve them. And now what are you going to do? But the parent who is hamstrung, who's held hostage by their guilt, is often going to have this place. All that I do for you. After all that I do for you. Right? That's a sign that it wasn't a gift. That it was an exchange for future returns. I would never do this to someone else. I hear parents say that. I've said that to my spouse, to my children, to others. Right? That's me expecting somebody else to take care of me. That's the thing about the rescuer. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They try to take care of other people so other people will take care of them. That's what the rescuer does. And as parents, we do that. Right? That's when parents talk about how much their children love them. If their children are going to abandon them. Right? When they start to talk about that, I say, no, that's not the thing. That's not the thing in parenting. I get it, because I have the same fears, because I have similar wounds. But parenting is not about getting love back. Parenting is about giving it out. And then finding ways, making sure that I'm taking care of me as a parent. That they're not taking care of me, or my spouse or my partner or others in my life are not taking care of me, that I'm learning to take care of myself. not waiting for somebody else to do it, or not hoping magically that because I've been the nice guy, the good guy, the kind, generous, loving person, that people will return it back to me. And then, of course, I have no choice. Did I skip one? I might have skipped one. No, I didn't. Just goes so fast. So this is an article from Lynn Forrest. I would encourage you to Google it. It's a great article. It's about 10 pages long, and where she goes through, talks about the drama triangle, and then writes about it. And so I'm going to share her concepts, her ideas. These three roles are actually all victim stances, blaming others for the role that they assume. Right? The persecutor has to be a victim to justify his or her attacks on other people. Right? It's not their fault. If this person wouldn't be doing this, I wouldn't have to do this. The rescuers get a sense of well-being by being the knight in shining armor and have very few self-care skills like that. So again, there's still a victim in all three of them. And she talks about this idea that we can cycle through them in our own mind, treating ourselves as persecutor, rescuer, and victim. Right? We can do that inside of ourselves, and we can cycle through them. And in relationships, we can cycle back and forth. And they're just these patterns to recognize that are really synonymous with codependency and really the opposite of authenticity, honesty, and awareness. People rotate among all the roles. It feeds and generates shame. It's based in it. It serves shame and guilt very well. What she asks us to do is to learn our preference, to start to know our patterns, our vulnerabilities, our susceptibilities. What particular role in our family were we most inclined or more inclined to assume, and are we recreating that in our relationships that are present? And like I said, we cycle through these roles externally and internally. And she calls these starting gates. She says all of us have a preference, a starting gate, a role that we tend to assume. And then she goes through and teaches us how to find our starting gate. She says that we can't get off the triangle unless we make it conscious. And that is, consciousness, awareness is the enemy of, it's the opposite, it's the antidote of mental health issues, of the drama triangle, right? It's an important part about how we extricate ourselves from patterns. Identifying your starting gate position, what hooks you. I used to have children and parents write, especially parents, they would write all the ways that their child could manipulate them, all the things that they could say. And parents were at first terrified of this until I explained, writing it down doesn't make it more powerful, it makes it less powerful, and I've told that story before. But I want to make it explicit. And by making it explicit, it takes away some of its power. It ruins it for everybody. So talk about what hooks you. What do you need to be? Do you need to be the good parent? Do you need to be the loving parent, the fair parent? What is it that hooks you? What is it that you don't want to be as a parent? That's a good place to start. Identify your cycles without judgment. Judgment is the enemy to self-awareness too, right? If we have judgment, anger, and rage toward our limitations, our woundedness, our imperfections, it's going to be hard for us to look at them. So we learn, hopefully in therapy with a good therapist, we learn to have compassion on ourselves and our humanness. We identify the pros, cons, trade-offs of each role. I was talking about that with the victim, for example, where I would have the depressed person write a benefits of depression paper. And so we start to talk about them in terms of the costs and the pros and the cons, not the badness or the goodness of it. What are the risks involved in assuming these roles, in assuming a specific role? Help the internal observer to recognize the beliefs, language, and behaviors of each role. And the doorway, she says, to begin to look at ourselves is through our feelings, right? And in most of the families that are involved in these kinds of patterns, there is a rule, often, mostly, always unspoken, about not feeling something painful, not feeling something uncomfortable. So the doorway to find it is to start to feel and to talk about, to work with a therapist. And then through those feelings, then begin to explore the beliefs about lives, about roles, about relationships that are underneath, that are creating those feelings. And then to unravel those faulty limiting beliefs. So the starting gate rescuer is classically codependent. The shadow aspect is over-mothering, right? People think of it, people will even describe codependency sometimes as too much love. It's not too much love. That's the perversion of it. That's the mutation of it. But it's a lack of love, right? And this is driving me crazy, especially in the climate that we have right now in our country. And I'm just going to digress for 1 second because I feel passionate about this. I'm going to write something about this soon. I hear the word narcissism thrown around, narcissist thrown around a lot. I can't be more clear than to say narcissism comes from a wound of not being seen. It does not come from being overvalued. It's impossible to be overvalued. You can't be overvalued. You can be valued the right amount, which is wonderful. But that comes with healthy connection. And when parents classically overvalue their children, it comes from a place of anxiety, of wanting to be seen a certain way by the child, of fear of abandonment of the child. It's a abandonment of the child. So it's not over-loving, over-mothering too much. It's a disconnect. Disconnect first from self and our own issues and what's really going on in our parenting, which leads to a disconnect from our child. Because mothering or fathering at its highest is connected, is honest, has good boundaries. It is loving, it is kind, it is compassionate. It has limitations because we're human. It has all those things. But we think of it sometimes as over-mothering. Smothering, controlling, and manipulative. It might be very subtle. I say all the time to my clients. I said it to the father I was describing earlier. Described him as the nicest control freak. And he laughed and thought it was funny. I said, you're not alone. A lot of people don't realize how controlling they are. Trying to get somebody to feel a certain way. Think about something a certain way. That gets in the way of their authenticity and honesty. They want to fix it and fulfill a sense of self by being needed, right? I think that's as clear as it can be. I think as parents, we're especially vulnerable to that trap. The magical belief is if I take care of them enough, they will take care of me. And I think we have that with our children. And I think it shows up when we start defining our child's problems by how little they love us or care about us. Because that's what we expected back. I think that's true of anybody. When you start to feel resentment that somebody's not taking care of you and the thought comes to your mind, look at what I did for them, look at all that I gave to them, you know you didn't give a gift. It's evidence to you that you were believing this, that if I take care of, if I do for them, they'll do for me. The greatest fear is ending up alone. I think that might be true of a lot of us. Follow your feelings to your core beliefs. Right? That's what she says. Follow your feelings, get to your core beliefs, and then with work and help from somebody else, start to unravel those core beliefs, those faulty core beliefs. The starting gate for the rescuer, the disappointment of this not happening may lead to martyrdom or victim stance. I said that. Hidden strings are attached. After all I've done for you, this is what I get. Resentment and gifts with strings attached, same thing, right? Children learn to use this to blame their rescuing parents because the model is that the parents are responsible for the child's behavior. So if your child is a blamer, it is worthwhile for you to look under the rock, if you will, that has the word rescuer painted on it, because that is what has worked for them. Right? That's the hook, and they've unconsciously been taught it. There's a need of the rescuer to identify the reward in keeping the other helpless and dependent. Oh, sorry, I said that wrong. There's a need to understand the reward that we have at keeping the other person helpless. It supports our ego, our sense of who we are. Our sense of self is reinforced, and we wanted to be needed, and we thought this ensured that we would not be abandoned. The starting gate for the persecutor. Shame-based, rage-based, and hiding deep pain and worthlessness. This is what I was talking about with the narcissist, right? We hear about that talked about. It's somebody who's got an inflated ego has low self-esteem. It's true. We know it. It's clear. It's obvious. An inflated ego, a sense of I'm better than you, always covers up insecurity. Always. Always, always. The shadow aspect is overfathering, like I said. The identification with the perpetrator is oftentimes people who have been the victims, if you will. I mean this word literally victim of a abusive persecutor in their life. oftentimes to save themselves from that fate going forward, will identify with the persecuted. They talk about this with the Holocaust, that the harshest of the guards were the Jews that were put in charge of the other Jews. They were the most frightening. It ensured their survival and protected them from being vulnerable. It's a power-based model. The world is hard to survive and I have to be ruthless. Rather than nurturing and directing, reinforcing and disciplining using brute force. Right? It's about control. It's the Darth Vader form of parenting. And like I said, domination hides shame and worthlessness. Always. Courageous people, honest people, they can be vulnerable. They can look at themselves. They have the courage to be imperfect. The greatest fear is powerlessness. The tools they use are bullying, preaching, blaming, lecturing, threatening, and interrogating. That sounds a little bit too uncomfortably like a lot of us, doesn't it? They deny their vulnerability the same way rescuers deny their needs. Like I said, superiority covers inferiority. They find justification for the abuse of others. Right? Physical escalated confrontations, litigations, and high conflict are common. Escaping the grid by becoming the bad guy. Like I said, in a less severe way, this is where these parents will come to us and say, I don't have a problem. The kids say the same thing sometimes. But oftentimes, it's the non-identified patient that assumes this role often, and the non-identified patient who assumes they don't have anything to work on in the equation. Because if they did, then they would feel responsible and feel guilty, and they've got to get that rid of. Got to get that out of them. The starting gate for the victim. The shadow aspect is the needy child. Beyond healthy dependency into frail, powerless, and defective. Right? There's a American bias that autonomy is valued more than connection many times, right? That's a part of our culture. And so taking that aside, right? Removing that from the equation, we still get to this point where we become helpless without the other. I even think that sometimes in marriage, people define love as need. I need you. That's not the same thing. Look at the book by James Hollis called The Eden Project, The Search for the Magical Other. He talks about that very clearly. Object relations theory talk about that. And so dependency is not the same as love. And we confuse them all the time. The greatest fear is I can't do it by myself. Often couples feelings of dependency with feelings of resentment towards rescuers. Or it's often coupled with feelings of dependency with feelings of resentment toward the rescuer. So the victim is angry at the rescuer and still dependent upon them. And we can see that in the parent-child relationship often. They enjoy making the rescuer fail to get even. It is part of the goal of the victim to fail, to frustrate and get back at the rescuer whom they resent. So no, that's sometimes when I say to parents, after several attempts that they make to try to make something better, I say, you understand, the goal here is for you to fail. You're supposed to be failing. That's the child's goal in this scenario. And then we talk about you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose. And the way that I encourage you to choose how to lose is through authenticity, honesty, and self-awareness and love. Often self-abusing, drugs, food, money problems, etc. It perpetuates the victim stance. They justify it. The take-home. I have a couple of pages of take-home. The take-home is that everybody suffers. That we need to be, it's really important that we get clear that not one is better than the other. They each serve their role. And everybody lacks the ability to take care of themselves, even the rescuer. There's this story that she tells, and I heard it in graduate school. I think it's just an anecdote about a little girl who sees her mother cutting off the end of a ham as she puts it to a pan to cook it in the oven. And she asks her mother, why are you doing that? And her mother says, well, that's the way my mother taught was the right way to cook a ham. So the grandmother lived nearby, and she goes and visits the grandmother, and she says, Grandma, why do you cut off the ends of the ham? And the grandmother explained, that's the right way that my mother told me how to cook ham. And then she asked her great-grandmother, great-grandmother, why do you cut off the ends of the ham? She said, well, in those days, I had a small oven and a small pan, and I couldn't fit a whole ham, so I would cut the end off of it so it could fit. And of course, this story illustrates that we do things in our families through generations without questioning them. And that's why it's so important, folks. It's so important, it's necessary for your children to question their family of origin. To do it in a safe place, right? To do it without self-harming, dangerous behaviors, ideally. But it's important for them to question it. It's important for you to question it. It really, really is important for you to question it. Like Alice Miller said, we have only one enduring weapon. Only one enduring weapon against our fight against mental illness, and that is the discovery of each of our unique childhoods, right? To figure out what we've been taught are our roles, what we've been taught that we're allowed to feel or not feel, or what's comfortable, and how oftentimes we rescue people to prevent what I call an empathic misery. And learning to value pain and difficulty. Even Lynn says in this article, even begin to celebrate difficult emotion. Painful feelings are the doorway into this awareness. Learning to not deny your feelings, trust them, go with them. The more irrational they are, this is so important. They say this in 12-step meetings. If it's hysterical, it's historical. And what that means is the more irrational and out of context, too big they are, the more it's evidence that they're based on some historical trauma. So follow them. Follow them with the guidance of a therapist. Learning to be honest with yourself. Beginning to own and interrupt your projections onto other people. Your disdain, your judgments of other people. They are a doorway into what you were taught about yourself. Intimacy is the goal, and many run away because it requires authenticity, feeling uncomfortable, and vulnerability. Okay? That's important. We all, I think, have an association with intimacy. That we think, oh, that's what I want. Well, guess what? It's hard. It's not easy. It requires us to go through some pain, to open ourselves up, to risk, to often be hurt, to risk being rejected, to risk exploring and showing things to another person that we believe, for all intents and purposes, are going to lead to our abandonment. And then if the other person is in it in the long run, and in it with you, and doing their work, you have the most rewarding experience ever, which is they stick in it with you and they show you their ugly warts. And because you're doing your work, you learn to accept and see them. Power and intimacy are not compatible. That's just true. Right? There has to be an absence of power, a surrender for intimacy to occur. Honesty with self and others is the key to intimacy. Self-love and care and self-care is a foundation. Learning to recognize our faulty beliefs about self-care and selfishness. Asking others to make us accountable, going to a therapist, going to 12-step meetings. Go to your 12-step meetings. Go to your Codependency Anonymous, your Al-Anon meetings. If you have substance use issues, go to the 12-step meetings for those. And find somebody to help you be accountable. Not in a harsh, judgmental way, but to ask you questions. To ask you to ask yourself difficult questions. Learn to negotiate boundaries. Not sacrificing core beliefs and what you need, but how can I negotiate boundaries and still maintain my core, my truth. First of all, she says, you have to find your truth. Second of all, she said, you learn to speak your truth. And then learning to treat others as an end, not a means to an end. That's a borrowed idea from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. And then learning your circle, what's inside of your control and what's outside of your control. It's the serenity prayer. It's the fourth stage, the two-part fourth stage in the I Feel statement that we teach here. And when you can learn the difference between what you can and can't control, an amazing amount of peace and serenity comes into your life. Less anxiety, less depression. All right, topic-related questions? No questions yet. I'll go to questions in just a second. Let me run over a couple of slides. I have a question or favor to ask of the group too. So here's our intensives and workshops coming up. We have the Finding You workshop. That's for any adult, any age, parent or not. That's April 11th through 14th. I'll be running that one in Park City, Utah. There are the Untitled Parent workshops. We'd like all parents, current parents, to go to at least one of those if they can. The ones on the right are deeper, personal, small group work. The ones on the left are multi-family, multi-parent, psychoeducational. and some wonderful experience work also. There are the emails there. Parent support groups, who have one in New York coming up. I'll be in Houston on Wednesday at that address. If any of you are near there, love to have you. And then in Chicago next month, we've changed the location to the Marriott Courtyard Chicago Highland Park, Northbrook. I don't think that's the right. I know it's on Lake Cook Road, but I think I wrote down the address wrong. But that's the one it is. Email Stephanie@evoketherapy.com for more information. Our Pursuits program is our non-clinical high adventure program for young adults and families. 1, 7, 14, and 28-day adventure trips. We want all families to go to 6 of these meetings while their children are with us. No exceptions. Follow us on social media for inspirational quotes, stories, pictures, and announcements. Here's a copy of my book. It's out on paperback now. What I was going to ask you, if any of you would like to go to Amazon and give a review of my book, I'm about 10 away from 50. When you get to 50, they start to promote it more. So if any of you have enjoyed it, got something out of it, even have a critique about it, I'd love to have you go to Amazon and give a review there if you haven't yet. Thank you. That would be helpful and good feedback for me. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page to buy books at the same price as on the regular Amazon, but a percentage of it goes to charity to help children who can't afford treatment. All right. Any questions before I wrap up, Stephanie? Still no questions. I must have done such a good job of explaining it. Now I put on here Monday, March 17th. So I just transposed the Monday and the Wednesday. This is Thursday, March 17th. When I get back from Houston, I'll be doing a webinar on parenting from the inside out. I'm redoing all the webinars under the Evoke logo, of course. And Parenting from the Inside Out is one of my favorite books, one of my top 3 books of all time for parents. And I'll be going over that book on Thursday, March 17th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And that should be Mountain Daylight Time, not Mountain Standard Time. Not that anyone's paying attention to that detail, but... All right, folks, before I wrap up, any questions? All right, looks like there's no questions. So if there are no questions, I'm going to close it down. Have a great evening. I hope these points of contact are helpful, and I will talk to all of you Thursday night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Take care. Bye-bye.